Have you ever been in a position where you're starting a new project or a new phase of life? There's a new challenge, and you get the sense that what's required of you is beyond having new skills. That really what's being called for is a new way of being. But how do you call in that new way of being? In reality, living a new story. In truth, there's a time tested, even ancient way of going about this, and it's called activating new archetypes. Now, I'm sure you've heard that word bandied about, or maybe it's the first time you've heard it and it sounds kind of interesting. Arca is just first, and type is variant. So it's really about getting to the first source. So you're going to see different variants of, hey, archetypes on the internet kind of spun out ad infinitum, and that's perfectly fine, but I think it's really helpful to also look at the most fundamental ones. So for example, because we know that these are universal archetypes, that everybody can have them, that it's something that we can try out energetically. We can leverage that energy. So let's say we've got the energy of the warrior. We need the energy of the warrior in order to rise up to the challenge of our getting promoted in our job, of getting in shape. We're going to need to marshal a lot more energy than we are when we're, for example, in the energy of the victim. Okay, that's sort of an extreme example, but you also can just be in the energy of the priestess, where you're more silent and not really moving. That has its place as well. It's just not the time for activity. So that gives a little bit of sense of the variety. And it's also really interesting to think when the archetype is working, we can all recognize it. Tolstoy famously wrote at the beginning of Anna Karenina, the very first line is, happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own individual way. So, in other words, a happy family looks the way we think a family should be. If it's an unhappy family, it's becoming something else. It's becoming like a little war zone, right? A little cult. That just gives you some idea. We've got the archetype of the lover. When love is going well, we're in that archetype. When it's something else, we might be in the archetype of a roommate. So where it really gets interesting is when you want to bring online and embody new archetypes. This can be so empowering. Now, every human has a certain set of archetypes in common, okay? So, Carl Jung was the first person to identify archetypes in modern psychology. It is not the case that he invented these. He doesn't claim to invent them. He claims that they are deep and primordial and rooted in the earth and in the cosmos. So it's energy that we can marshal. But not all of us have every archetype. However, we can move into certain archetypes as archetypes of destiny, okay? And that may not be our destiny, but we want to make that movement. So for example, every human has the archetype of a child. We all were children. Every human has the archetype of victim. We all can be victims sometimes. Now, when something that we don't want to happens, we naturally will fall into the archetype of the victim. In those moments, we are challenged to transform that lead into gold. If it's a disease, we need to transform into the archetype of the survivor, do everything that we can, into the archetype of the warrior to keep on going against all odds. This is quite different than some archetypes when we're just in our day-to-day life as a ordinary worker, right? And when we want to start a new project, we want to move into that archetype. Do I want to be a leader? Is it time to move into the queen when I've been the servant? So these are moments and periods of transformation, of being initiated into a higher level of being and the next phase of our growth. And the first place that we all see these are in the ancient myths and fairy tales that become the basis for our most beloved and iconic movies and novels. These stories that stay with us because we saw a character move from a unfortunate situation, for example, a child that's victimized or a lover that's jilted and they just don't know what to do, and then they move, but stage by stage, into the archetype of the hero or the heroine, right? And we all have that capacity. We may not be called to such an arduous task, but it certainly makes life more interesting, richer, and dynamic if we are activating new archetypes when the time comes. Otherwise, we are not really fully engaged and alive, right? And so the next question is, how do we work with archetypes? How do we learn about them? The first is through stories. Stories are all about archetypal transformation. The good stories are, the deeper stories are, the sacred stories are. And those are the ones that really enrich us. And you probably encountered stories that make you think, wow, I want to transform that way. And that is indicating that you may have that archetype. Otherwise, it wouldn't be speaking to you. And then to get closer to these archetypes, to learn more, of course, we can work with our dreams. There's whole methodologies around that. We also can simply identify what archetype we want to move into and work with it in images, for example, oracle decks, tarot, and make an altar to that archetype. For example, if you're moving from being an employee who's being told what to do, almost like a servant archetype in classic terms, to a queen, to an entrepreneur, you can create an altar to that. You can work with divine feminine images of the great goddesses and ascended masters. These hold really powerful patterns of energy that we can access, that we can work with. So really, it's very transformative to work with those images and the dynamics in detail, and that's what I'll be talking about in a whole series of videos. So stay tuned, especially the divine feminine archetypes. And I'm really curious, which archetypes are you wanting to activate? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And I so appreciate your time and attention. Have a blessed day.